When someone goes missing, the world keeps turning, but their loved ones are left behind carrying an uncertainty no family should ever have to bear. As headlines fade, they're often left to face that uncertainty in silence. This is Echoes of the Missing. I'm your host, Jamie, and here we do more than interrupt that silence. We make sure these stories aren't just told, but echoed until answers are found. When someone disappears, they're more than a headline. They leave behind unfinished stories, unanswered questions, and the people who never stop waiting. A suitcase full of clothing left untouched. A bedroom frozen in time. 11 witnesses. One family without any answers. This isn't just a story about a disappearance. It's the story of a person whose absence still echoes through the lives of those who love them. 11 people reported watching Terrence Woods Jr. run into Idaho wilderness. Years later, no one can say with certainty why. What made him run? Before I get into today's case, I want to tell you why this one stays with me and why it felt like it had to be my first episode. I'm the mother of a young adult son, and when I think about Terrence, I can't help but picture my own child. And honestly, I think a lot of us know that feeling. Whether you're a parent, a sibling, a friend, or just a person who loves someone deeply, the idea of someone you love vanishing is almost impossible to sit with. No answers, no explanation. To me, not knowing feels like the cruelest part. While the rest of the world moves on, this is the reality Terrence Woods Jr.'s family has been living with every single day for 8 years. Before Terrence became the center of a missing persons case, he was simply Terrence, a son, a brother, a dreamer. Every photo I've seen of him shows the same thing: a big, genuine smile, and maybe just a touch of goofiness. I think that matters because it's so easy for a person's name to become tied only to the worst thing that happened to them. Terrence grew up in Prince George's County, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C., with siblings in a close-knit family. According to his father, Terrence Woods Sr., he was outgoing, adventurous, and endlessly curious. That curiosity would shape nearly every major decision he made. The more you learn about him, the more you'll realize he wasn't someone who wanted a small, ordinary life. He wanted to see the world. That dream would eventually take him farther from home than he'd ever been. From a young age, it was clear Terrence wasn't afraid to speak his mind. One story that really stood out to me was when he was just 12 years old, he wrote a letter to President George W. Bush, sharing his strong opinions about the United States' involvement in overseas conflicts. And it definitely wasn't a fan letter. That curiosity and boldness didn't fade as he got older. If anything, it became more focused. Terrence studied broadcast journalism at the University of Maryland, where he anchored a student-produced news program, and he stood out to his professors. That says a lot because there's a difference between simply being another student in a large university and being someone people genuinely remember. And Terrence was remembered. One of his professors and mentors, Bethany Swain, said he was talented, driven, and very clear about what he wanted. And what he wanted was London. She said Terrence made it known that his goal was to build a career there as a journalist. What strikes me here is how sure he was of his dream at such a young age. In 2013, he earned his bachelor's degree, a huge milestone not just for Terrence, but for the family who had supported him along the way. After graduation, he didn't waste time chasing that dream. He moved to London, earned a master's degree in international journalism, and began carving out a place for himself in the media world. To me, that part of his story shows just how serious he was about building the life he wanted. That next chapter was helped along by Joanna Abai, who was known for helping young people from underrepresented backgrounds break into the television industry. Terrence made such a strong impression on her that instead of just sending an email, he hand-delivered a letter expressing his interest in the opportunity. I actually love that detail because it tells you so much about his personality. Bold, intentional, and willing to do something memorable to stand out. Joanna helped connect him with his first roles, and according to her, the feedback from employers was overwhelmingly positive. This is an important detail. I want you to remember it. Terrence's career was gaining momentum, and nothing suggesting it was about to take such an unexpected turn. As a freelance production assistant, Terrence started building a resume that included work on major productions like The Voice UK. He traveled to different countries for work, and even in the middle of building his own career, he found small ways to bring his family along with him, like picking up a shot glass for his dad from every place he visited. He was seeing the world the way he always wanted to, and he was still thinking about home while he did it. In the summer of 2018, Terrence moved back to Maryland and was living with his father again, ready to begin a new chapter. His father later said that was exactly how Terrence saw it, as a fresh start. And to me, that makes this part of the story especially heartbreaking, because he wasn't looking backward. He was looking ahead. At that point, he had already built a life that reflected the ambition people saw in him from the beginning. He had done what he set out to do. He had gone abroad, earned advanced degrees, built a career, and started making his mark. Everything he worked toward finally seemed to be coming together. He had no way of knowing where the next opportunity would take him. By the fall, after moving back to Maryland, Raw TV reached out to Terrence about a job working on the Gold Rush series in Idaho. Since he had worked with them before while living in London, I can imagine that call felt both familiar and validating, like proof that he was still moving forward in the career he had fought to build. On September 30th, his dad took him to the airport for the trip. And honestly, the exchange they had before he left was one of those details that stays with you. Terrence said, "See you later." And his dad answered, "See you sooner." It was ordinary, loving, the kind of goodbye families say every day without realizing it might matter later. From there, Terrence flew to Montana, where he was supposed to meet the rest of the crew. And together, they were heading to Idaho for filming. There was nothing about the trip itself that seemed unusual. He even texted his dad after landing to say he made it safely. And I think that's part of what makes this case so unsettling. Everything about that day sounded like the start of a routine work opportunity, not the beginning of one of the most baffling disappearances I've ever researched. On October 5th, 2018, the crew was out filming near Penman Mine in Oro Grande, Idaho, when everything took a turn that still does not make sense. According to the crew's account, as later relayed by Terrence Woods Jr., Terrence had reportedly suffered an anxiety attack earlier that morning and was described as acting strange in the time leading up to his disappearance. But I also think it's fair to question that claim, because was this a clearly observed event, or was it part of a narrative built afterward to explain behavior no one could really make sense of? I think that detail is important, but I also think it needs to be handled carefully, because it comes from the crew's version of events rather than something independently confirmed. From what has been reported, Terrence seemed off that day. And there were claims that at one point he tried to grab a drone out of the air. Later, as the day was wrapping, he told one of the women helping the crew that he needed to use the restroom. But instead of stepping away and coming right back, he dropped his radio, took off his belt, and ran down a steep embankment into the trees. One person later said he was running like a hare, and I keep coming back to that description. It's vivid. It suggests this was not someone just casually walking off set. According to some crew members, when they got to the edge, they could still see him below, running, and then he was just gone. That is the part I cannot get past. I spent a lot of time looking into the terrain around Penman Mine. Videos, photos, topo information, articles, and the one thing that stood out to me is that this was not some flat, easy place to move through. It looked rugged, rocky, broken up, and full of uneven ground, with crevices, hidden drop-offs, and holes everywhere. It was far from a smooth running surface. And that only adds to the questions for me. It also underscored just how many possibilities the terrain leaves open, and how difficult it would be to rule out any of them with confidence. For me, that's what makes this case feel even more troubling. Because it's not just about where Terrence is now, it's about what made him run in the first place. What was the catalyst? What was the trigger? Because something made him take off like that. And to me, that may be one of the biggest unanswered questions in this whole case. Once Terrence disappeared, the search that followed should have brought clarity. Instead, it seems to have deepened the mystery. According to reporting, law enforcement and search teams used helicopters, ground teams, and search dogs in the days after he vanished, combing through that rough Penman Mine area from the air and on foot. And still, no clear trace of him was found. No confirmed sign that searchers could point to and say with confidence, this is where he went. That part matters to me, because if Terrence truly ran the route witnesses described, you would expect something: a scent trail, clothing, a personal item, blood, some indication of where his path continued. But the public reporting leaves the impression that even with the dogs involved, investigators did not get a reliable track that led them to him. If the anxiety attack narrative took hold early, I think it's fair to wonder whether that early narrative influenced the direction of the investigation. Another detail people keep circling back to is the condition of some of the crew members who reportedly went after Terrence. There have been accounts that they came back scratched up with torn clothes and blood on them. And that detail cuts two ways. On one hand, the terrain around that mine was rugged enough that a frantic scramble down an embankment through brush and broken ground could absolutely leave people with injuries. On the other hand, in a case with this many gaps, I understand why some people hear that detail and wonder whether those injuries point to something darker that has never been explained. I want to be careful there because that is a question, not proof. But it is one more reason this case continues to leave people uneasy. And then there's the layout of the area itself. The way this has been described, Terrence did not just step into a few trees and disappear. He reportedly ran down a steep embankment or mountainside over a drop of roughly 10 feet and into the woods below. From there, the woods opened toward a road. And that detail, for me, is important because it means the landscape was not just a dead end of wilderness. There was at least the possibility of movement from that rough slope into a tree cover and then toward a place where a vehicle could pass. Whether that's what happened, we simply don't know. But that geography leaves more than one possible path. And when people act like there was only one way this could have ended, I think that's worth talking about. What unsettles me most is that the investigation still seems to leave us in the same place, relying heavily on the accounts of the people who were with him, while the physical evidence never fills in the blanks. Based on what has been publicly reported, there is still no physical evidence that independently confirms Terrence was ever on that slope in Idaho, beyond the statements of the people who said they saw him run. Reporting has also pointed to Raw TV keeping a tight lid on what the crew could say publicly. There may be ordinary reasons for that in a serious case like this that I'm not privy to. Legal advice, company policy, protecting an active investigation. But I also think it's fair to say that silence can deepen suspicion when the facts already feel incomplete. Law enforcement has said they did not find evidence of wrongdoing, and I want to respect that. But I also think it's fair to say the investigation has not brought peace. If anything, it has left more questions than answers. Another part of this case that raises questions for me is what Terrence's parents say happened when they met with Raw TV producer Simon Gee after Terrence disappeared. Earlier in this episode, I talked about how important it was to look at the people who knew Terrence before Idaho. Former employers and colleagues spoke highly of him. They described him as a talented professional and someone they would gladly work with again. That's why this meeting stands out to me. According to Terrence Woods Jr.'s recollection, instead of focusing on what happened to Terrence or offering meaningful answers or comfort of some sort, Gee spent much of the conversation criticizing him. Woods Sr. has said Gee told them, "I had high hopes for Terrence, but he did not live up to them." What came next has always struck me as particularly odd. Gee reportedly said he once asked Terrence to bring him a piece of fruit, and Terrence responded by asking what kind of fruit he wanted. Honestly, that doesn't sound like incompetence to me. It sounds like a young man asking a perfectly reasonable clarifying question of someone he barely knows. When I compare that story with the overwhelmingly positive accounts from the people who worked with Terrence before this production, the contrast is hard to ignore. It doesn't prove anyone was wrong, but it does make me question why the picture Simon Gee painted was so different from nearly everyone else who knew Terrence professionally. And if you're a parent desperately searching for answers about how your child disappeared, hearing criticism instead of clarity would not only be painful, but deeply frustrating. Let's talk theories. This is the part of the case I keep circling back to. For me, the biggest mystery is not just what happened to Terrence after he disappeared. It's what made him run in the first place. What could make somebody drop their radio, take off their belt, and run full speed into rugged terrain with no warning? That question matters to me just as much as where he is now. So when I look at the theories in this case, I'm not just thinking about where he may have ended up. I'm thinking about what could have pushed him into that moment. And with every theory, I ask the same two questions. Why might this fit? And what keeps it from fully landing? Theory 1. Panic. This one feels plausible because that area was steep, rocky, and full of hazards. If Terrence ran the way witnesses described, I can absolutely see how he could have fallen, gotten trapped, or ended up somewhere searchers never found him. Old mining terrain is unforgiving, but what keeps this theory from fully sticking is that even Terrence's father questioned the idea that his son could have taken off that way in the first place. He has said that Terrence was flat-footed, and that the family has spent hundreds of dollars on inserts for his shoes, and that his son was not at all athletically inclined. So when people describe Terrence running like a hare down a steep mountain, his father has made it clear that doesn't line up with the son he knew. And that carries weight for me because a father knows his son, and logically questioning one part of an account doesn't necessarily mean questioning every detail later. Theory 2, mental health. This theory gets brought up a lot because of what the crew reportedly said about Terrence's behavior that day. According to the report, they claimed he seemed off. And as I mentioned earlier, at one point appeared to be reaching for a drone in the sky. On the surface, I can understand why people look at that and think maybe he was disoriented, overwhelmed, or having some kind of a panic or mental health episode. Sudden behavior changes can and do happen. And if someone's in distress, they can act in ways that make no sense to the people around them. But what gives me pause is how strongly Terrence Sr. pushed back on that idea. In reporting from Deadline, Terrence Woods Jr. said that his son had no mental problem, no health problem, no communication problem. And that is critical to me because it shows the people who knew him best did not see this as fitting who he was. I also think it's important to remember that some of the early mental health related claims were later disputed. So while I cannot completely rule this theory out, I also don't think it should be treated as the default explanation just because it was introduced early. Theory 3, personal threat. This feels very possible to me when I think about the timing. Terrence had texted his family that he wanted to come home early, which they said was unusual. His mother has publicly wondered whether he may have been afraid of someone he was working with. And when I put that next to the way he ran, fast, suddenly, and without explanation, it raises the question of whether he felt he needed to get away from something or someone. One possibility is that he saw something, heard something, or suddenly felt unsafe. What makes this theory even more interesting to me is the geography people describe: a steep run down the mountainside, a drop into the woods, and then a route that eventually led toward a road. If that's accurate, then one possible theory is that Terrence did not blindly run into the wilderness. He may have been trying to get somewhere specific, away from the immediate scene and toward a place where he could flag down help, encounter a person, or even get in a vehicle. Could he have reached that road and gotten into a car? I think that is a fair theory to raise. But I also want to be careful with it because there is no public evidence proving that happened, and no confirmed sighting that places him in a vehicle. So for me, this is one of those theories that stays in that frustrating middle ground, plausible enough to consider, but still unproven. Theory 4, foul play. This is a tough one to think about. This is the theory a lot of people circle back to because the whole case feels so strange. The isolated location, the fact that no trace of him was found, the suitcase left behind, the clean, folded clothes, the muddy shoes in the bag, and much of what we know about those final moments comes from the people who were with him. All of that leaves room for doubt. It's not hard to understand why people wonder if something happened out there that has never been fully explained. However, law enforcement has said they found no evidence of foul play, and I don't want to present suspicion as proof. So for me, this theory remains possible, but again, it's unproven, and that is part of what makes this case so frustrating. Theory 5, fed up and angry. This theory feels worth talking about because sometimes people do hit a breaking point without planning what comes next. If Terrence was unhappy with the trip, frustrated with the work environment, or feeling done with everything in that moment, I could see how that could lead him to leaving the scene. His father said it was unusual for Terrence to want to leave a shoot early, but there have also been public questions about whether he may have been uncomfortable with someone he was working with. I can see why people consider this, but what makes it a little less convincing is that even if he ran off angry or frustrated, we still come back to the same issue. Where did he go? And why was there never any trace of him? Being upset might explain the first few seconds or moments, it still does not fully explain the complete disappearance that followed. Theory 6, New Life. I think this is another theory people naturally consider, especially when you look at the comments from his mother, Valerie, that he was tired of all the traveling and had been thinking about a different career path. There's also been reporting that his journal included language about a great reset. And I can see why that phrase makes people wonder if he was thinking about a major life change. On paper, that could make it sound like maybe he wanted out and chose to disappear. But this is where I struggle with that theory. Wanting a new direction in life is not the same thing as wanting to vanish from everyone who loves you. And when I put that idea next to the clean folded clothes and the fact that he had told his family he was planning to come home, it just doesn't sound like someone carefully setting up a brand new life. It sounds more like someone who wanted change, not disappearance. Theory 7, Self-harm. When someone suddenly runs off, disappears, and leaves behind more questions than answers, it's understandable that some people wonder whether self-harm could be an explanation. It's a possibility that often comes up in cases like this. However, based on the information that's been made public, there's nothing that clearly points in that direction. The people who knew Terrence best have consistently pushed back against that idea, saying it doesn't fit the person they knew. And while no possibility can be completely ruled out, this explanation feels less supported than several of the other questions surrounding this case. And that brings me to the part where I want to be honest about where I land. Because after looking at all of this, there's one theory that makes more sense to me than the others, even if I still cannot say with certainty exactly what happened. The theory that resonates most with me is that something may have gone wrong before Terrence ever made it to Idaho. I want to be clear here because I'm not saying I can prove it. I can't. But when I look at the pieces that have been publicly discussed, that is the possibility I struggle the most to shake. According to the Nancy Grace episode regarding Terrence, the film crew posted photos across their social media from their time in Idaho. Terrence is not in any of them. His suitcase was returned to Terrence Sr. with his clothing still clean and neatly folded, 4 days worth of it, with only muddy shoes alongside them in a plastic bag. And from what's been shared publicly, his family was receiving text messages from Terrence, but they weren't hearing his voice on the phone while he was in Idaho. One question I keep coming back to is whether we actually know independently that Terrence made it to Idaho. It's unclear whether investigators verified his travel through airline records. Investigators have said they interviewed people outside the production crew, including motel staff, restaurant employees, and a local transportation coordinator, who all reported seeing Terrence there. But the records and interviews supporting these accounts have never been released to the public, leaving me wondering how much of what we know can be verified. And as we know from cases like these, eyewitness accounts are not always accurate. Finally, the hotel room photo posted to Terrence's Instagram account. A view from a hotel window with a simple caption, Idaho. And I keep asking myself, how much does this really prove by itself? Is it Terrence posting and texting? Or is there something more ominous going on? I cannot say that is fact, and I'm not suggesting it happened. I'm simply acknowledging the questions that remain unanswered based on what we know. At the same time, this theory is hard for me in another way. Because if something really did happen earlier in the trip, that would mean multiple people stayed silent and have continued to do so for years. That's hard for me to wrap my mind around. I find it difficult to reconcile, but not impossible. That's the part that keeps me from saying I feel 100% certain. Still, when I weigh all the possibilities, this is the one that leaves me with the fewest loose ends, even though it still leaves far too many. One source I found particularly interesting was the Dr. Phil episode featuring Terrence's parents and the Idaho County Sheriff. According to Raw TV, Terrence had requested to leave the assignment early because his mother was supposedly having surgery. But during the interview, Terrence's mother, Valerie, flatly disputed that claim. That raised an immediate question for me. If that explanation wasn't true, then where did it come from? Terrence's parents also shared something else that really stood out. They said that their son told them he wasn't feeling good about the trip before he left, although he never explained exactly why. This doesn't tell us what happened, but it makes the picture of that morning much more complicated. During the episode, Terrence's father showed Dr. Phil the contents of the suitcase that was returned after his disappearance. Inside were the 4 days' worth of neatly folded clean clothes. According to Terrence Sr., Terrence took tremendous pride in his appearance and personal hygiene. He said there was simply no way his son would have worn the same outfit for 4 consecutive days. His mother, Valerie, added another detail that challenged the narrative surrounding Terrence's disappearance. She described her son as someone who was not athletic in the least. In fact, she said she'd never seen him climb a tree or even a ladder for that matter. So when witnesses described Terrence running through the rugged Idaho terrain like a hare, she struggled to reconcile that image with the son she knew. Terrence's father also expressed frustration with the Idaho County Sheriff's Office, saying the family had received very few answers over the years. During the episode, Dr. Phil had an opportunity to question the sheriff directly. The sheriff stated that the case remains open, but acknowledged that no one was actively looking for Terrence. One exchange caught my attention. When Dr. Phil asked why the family felt they weren't receiving enough information, the sheriff responded by asking, "What have they not been given?" He also stated that the names of the witnesses from the crew were in the report. At least a couple of them. But that response left me with more questions. Were all of the crew members identified? Or only a few? Or two? If only some names were provided, that would leave several individuals the family still wouldn't have the ability to contact or question themselves. The sheriff also stated that Raw TV had been cooperative throughout the investigation and had even offered to meet with the family. He went on to say that he personally knew 2 members of the crew and considered them ethical and moral people. That doesn't imply favoritism or wrongdoing, but when families are looking for answers, even the appearance of familiarity can raise understandable concerns. Dr. Phil also pressed the sheriff on another issue that many people have questioned. Why would the crew leave the area when one of their own was still missing? The sheriff's response was essentially that there was no sign of Terrence, no track, and no trail to follow. The search efforts had not produced evidence showing where he had gone. When asked whether there was investigative information being withheld from the family, the sheriff said that Terrence's journal and tablet had been provided to them. At one point, Terrence's parents discussed wanting the case formally closed so they could gain full access to the investigative file and conduct their own review of everything collected over the years. Notably, Raw TV declined to appear on the episode. After watching the interview for myself, I'll be honest, I didn't walk away feeling reassured. The sheriff's responses felt defensive at times, and from my perspective, dismissive of the family's concerns. Doesn't mean he's wrong, and it certainly doesn't mean there's any wrongdoing. But when a family has spent years searching for answers, empathy and transparency can go a long way. I can completely understand why Terrence's parents left that conversation feeling frustrated and unheard. One of the hardest parts of this case is hearing what Terrence's disappearance has done to the people who love him. His father, Terrence Sr., and his mother, Valerie, and other family members have spent years living in a kind of pain that never really settled because there's never been a resolution, no clear truth, no way to bring him home. Terrence Sr. has been especially open about what that kind of uncertainty does to a person. In one interview, he said it was like a cancer eating him from the inside. And honestly, that comparison is hard to shake because it captures the slow, constant damage of not knowing. Terrence Sr. has also spoken publicly about keeping Terrence's bedroom exactly the way it was the day he dropped him off at the airport, untouched, frozen in time, almost like part of him is still waiting for his son to walk back through the door. That detail says everything. That's what unresolved loss can do to a family. It keeps them stuck somewhere between hope and heartbreak. Terrence's family continues pressing for answers and working to keep his story in front of the public. And that's so important because when the years keep passing, families so often end up carrying the weight of keeping a case alive all by themselves. What comes through in every interview and every statement is not just grief, it's determination. They are mourning, yes, but they're also fighting to make sure Terrence is not reduced to a mystery, fighting to make sure he's remembered as a person, and fighting for the answers they deserve. No matter which theory you come back to, one truth stays the same. Terrence Woods Jr. is still missing, and the people who love him are still living without answers. That's what makes this case stay with me. It's not just a mystery. It's silence, the gaps, the empty spaces where a son, a brother, and a friend should be. And maybe that's why this case has resonated with me. Because until Terrence is found or until the truth is finally uncovered, this story is not over. His family is still waiting, still hoping, still waking up every day in a reality they never asked for. And they shouldn't have to carry that weight alone. Terrence Woods Jr. was 26 years old when he disappeared on October 5, 2018, near Penman Mine outside of Oro Grande, Idaho. He's described as a black man with black hair and brown eyes, about 5'9" and around 150 pounds. He was last known to be wearing a light brown sweatshirt with black cargo pants. Terrence also has a tattoo of a black oval on the inside of his left wrist, along with scars on both calves. If you have any information about Terrence's disappearance, no matter how small it may seem, please contact the Idaho County Sheriff's Office at 208-983-1100. Somebody out there knows something. Somebody may remember a detail that they thought didn't matter. And that could be the one detail that finally helps bring Terrence home. Or at the very least, gives his family the answers they've been waiting for. I'm your host, Jamie, and this has been Echoes of the Missing. Thank you for listening. Until next time, stay safe, hug your people, and when someone you love calls, answer that phone.